we are live now. So thank you so much and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sumit Kumar and I currently lead the climate change vertical at PDAG. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers for today's webinar and all the participants who have you took time from the busy schedule to attend the launch of the newly monthly webinar series. And we have sort of named it as Where's the Public in the Public Policy, which basically aims to facilitate a series of conversation to inform the policy discourse on some of the most pressing challenges on sustainability and social inclusion. And this series is particularly focused on key ideas, debates, frameworks to re-examine a people-centered approach in formulation and execution of the public policy pathways, particularly in climate change, just transition, labor markets, internal migration, governance in the underserved regions, and sports for development. The topic that we have chosen for today's webinar is people-centered climate futures. Is it a possibility? We have sort of put in a question mark to that. Arindam, who is my colleague and is also the co-founder and partner at PDAG, will be sort of co-hosting today's webinar with me. But before handing over the baton to Arindam, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our three distinguished speakers who are experts in their respective areas of work. So starting with the first speaker, Varad Pande, he's a climate change and sustainability leader who has over 20 years of experience working across climate policies as a ministerial advisor in the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Rural Development. He has also experience working in climate investing, grant making at a global impact investment firm, and as a climate strategy consultant to companies, foundations, and countries. He has a master's in public administration in international development from Harvard University, a master's from University of Cambridge, and a BA from St. Stephen's. His current area of focus includes climate finance, adaptation and resilience, and digital public good for climate. Our second speaker is Soumya Kapoor Mehta. She is a senior social specialist with the Social Sustainability and Inclusion Global Practice of the World Bank. She currently co-leads the India Gender and Inclusion Platform at the World Bank. She has interest and analytical skills in the area of gender, poverty reduction strategies, and social inclusion challenges. She has worked on several of the bank's flagship reports and has 2 books to her credit. Prior to joining the bank, Soumya has worked for iWage, UNICEF, Government of India, the Center for Policy Research, and at SEWA, and was a visiting fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She holds a master's in economics from the University of Cambridge. Our third speaker, Roli Srivastava, she is a Mumbai-based journalist with the Thomson Reuters Foundation and reports on climate change, just transition, gender, and migration. In a career spanning over 2 decades, she has worked with major Indian newspapers, including The Hindu, where she was a deputy editor, The Times of India, where she was the editor on special projects. Her investigation have won her the Fitzo Journalism Award, Ladli Media, and Advertising Awards for Gender Sensitivity in 2020. She also won the Robert Bosch Stiftung's India-Germany Media Ambassador Fellowship in 2015 and has presented her stories at the Global Investigative Journalism Conference in 2019 and 2021. She is also a trainer at journalists training workshops conducted by the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Before sort of handing over it to Arindam, I would just try to sort of lay down some of the flow rules. So all the participants who have joined in, they can type in their questions, mentioning whom they would like their questions to be answered by. I would also request them to restrict their question to just one and keep it a bit short, crisp, and make it a little direct. And all these questions will be sort of taking at the end. So without any further ado, I would request Arindam to take over the floor. Over to you, Arindam. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sumit, for what could be a perfect kind of introduction to the webinar series, as well as to our very esteemed speakers who are practitioners, researchers, and writers, in their own way, have kind of shaped the narrative around climate change, sustainability, inclusion, and just transition in the last few years within the country. And when we speak about this topic, people-centered climate futures, Before moving on to the speakers to hear from them, I'd like to just lay out what we at PDAG kind of, think about this entire statement. So when we speak of people-centered climate futures, it's mostly referring to a vision of a future in which the needs, rights, and the aspirations of people should be and ought to be at the center of efforts to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change, which essentially means that the climate actions being undertaken, whether by the public institutions, the state as an institution, or by private enterprises, should not just be focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions or transitioning to renewable sources and protecting the natural environment, but also on promoting social justice, equity, human well-being, and equitable development within the larger lens of climate and climate change and its resilience and adaptation. And at PDAG, we have been working over the last 5 years to better understand and unpack this concept of people-centered public policy, including obviously climate change, that recognizes, particularly in the context of climate change, how it affects different people in different ways, depending on factors such as geography, gender, demography, socioeconomic conditions, inequality, and other persistent socioeconomic factors. And as a kind of beginning introductory point, I think we strongly feel that it is essential for the entire ecosystem, the public policy and the governance ecosystem, to kind of understand and address the underlying inequalities and injustices that further exacerbate climate vulnerabilities and have been limiting access to climate solutions, particularly voices from indigenous people and marginalized groups in some of the very underserved regions of the country in which we have worked. So without wasting any further time, I think we start with hearing from Varad in terms of what his understanding and what his experience has to say about how climate finance can play a very crucial role in supporting people and community-centered climate futures, especially in the context of India. Over to you, Varad.
Thank you, Arindam, and thank you, Sumit, and for starting us out. Delighted to be here. Great to see what you guys have built at PDAG over the last almost 5 years now, and also to reconnect with my old friend Soumya on this conversation. Great to see that all of us are sort of working at different aspects of what is perhaps the most existential problem facing humanity today. I wanted to just start by making a few meta points, and I'll come to your finance point, Arindam. One is, the term people-centric climate futures. I think it's a great framing of the challenge, but it has this problem, what I call the ESG problem, which is that it means different things to different people. And because of that, I think getting an action agenda on something like this is not going to be easy, right? To some people, it is like what you defined, making the climate transition work for everyone, essentially. In some other conversations we hear, it's really about compensating those who lose their jobs or something. So there's a narrow framing, there's a broad framing, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a result, I think we end up having too many conversations, different conversations at the same time. And I think aligning at broad principles can still happen, but then devil is always in the details. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second is, the climate futures is both a massive threat and a massive opportunity, right? And I think you all will probably agree with this, that on the one hand, it conjures up all these images of job losses, social unrest, decline of certain regions, difficulties of reskilling people, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, it is an opportunity to create let's say a workforce for the future and a new model of development, which is, lays the foundations for a sustainable future prosperity, especially important for the global South, which is sort of behind on many parameters of economic and social. Can this be an opportunity to sort of leapfrog into a different model? So, it's both a threat and an opportunity. The third thing I wanted to say was that it's very important we learn from the lessons of the past as we plan for climate futures. And in particular, I think we tend to underestimate the challenges of transition and can end up doing a lot of wishful thinking and drinking our own Kool-Aid, as the Americans say. I wanted to point the audience to an excellent piece 2 days ago in the Mint newspaper by India's Chief Economic Advisor Anantha Nageshwaran and 2 of his colleagues in the Indian Economic Service, who have sounded a cautionary note on India's green transition by saying, by looking at some fantastic literature of the Western countries, including the US, where the manufacturing decline has, due to various globalization trends over the last 30 years, the manufacturing decline in many parts of the US has been persistent, has led to poor social outcomes, suicides, after closure of regions that were in the old economy that essentially got globalized. And that has persisted for 20, 30 years, as evidence now showing that, right? So, and similarly, our own experience, I suppose, of many large development projects, whether it's large dams or others, where, R&R is often talked about, but often not done in a very effective way, and typically done in a technocratic, top-down kind of way. So we need to learn from the past and not be over-optimistic about this. And we need to work really hard to make this one actually work and make it people-centric. And the last point I'll make in my opening remarks is on your finance point, which is to say, of course, all of this requires a lot of money. And we need almost a new accounting paradigm. And by that, I mean that, the elephant in the room in a lot of this is, where is the business case for private finance for a lot of stuff that this requires, right? And can we think of, usually we think of financial rate of return. Can we think of an impact rate of return for people-centric climate futures, which incorporate social, economic, and environmental aspects? Are we willing to collectively take a more holistic lens on the return on investment? And what might this look like? In the same vein, is the global north, which many would argue have, used up a large share of the carbon space, are they willing to contribute sufficiently to this problem? We all know this magic number of $100 billion, which has been floating around in climate negotiations since 2009. And we still are not even at 100 billion, where we need 3 to 5 trillion a year to make the green transition work. So in that context, how are we going to raise the resources? Are we going to see people living up to their commitments? And so there's natural skepticism, I think, from past experiences, from the history of climate negotiations. And I think a lot of work needs to be done on trust building, on consensus building, and on measurement of both impacts and financial flows, if we are to make this work. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Varad, for the wonderful and I think very pointed opening remarks. And just picking on the strand on where you mentioned about, the need to kind of remember the past also, as to what kind of things have happened when the world globally has gone through multiple transitions in terms of economic advancement, development, and other kind of, whether it's industrialization or other kind of key avenues. On this note, I'd like to bring in Soumya here. And, as someone who kind of also leads the sustainability practice in World Bank with obviously the lot of focus on gender, how do you see, Soumya, social inclusion to be a key lever for what could be probably called a people-centered energy transition framework?
Thanks, firstly, Arindam, for inviting me. It's great to be here and also to be talking about it also from a very relevant perspective for the World Bank as well. We have recently, we are going to fund a huge investment in green hydrogen, about 1 billion this year, 2 billion in the next 2 or 3 months again. And this is top at our agenda, and of course also the just transition from coal. So just to start off by saying the first most primary important thing when we talk about a people-centered transition is that people are not sitting idle. I mean, if you think about people who are living in villages or on these coal mines or along the coast, who are facing cyclones in Orissa, they have their own adaptation strategies. So one needs to, Varad made a very relevant point about learning from the past, but you can also learn from people themselves. There are many practices in India for community-led adaptation, which are being scaled up by NGOs, like, Mahila Housing Trust invests in resilience housing, Orissa has done a fantastic job of training, people to manage cyclone shelters, and the Apda Mitra schemes and so on. So there are a lot of community practices that can be leveraged. And equally, in the tribal domain, you have people undertaking community forestry and, looking at farming practices that are much more sustainable. And I think we have now started thinking of locally led climate planning. I think it's when you talk about climate finance, we also have to think of how do you build the capacity of the lowest tier, not only the districts, but even the panchayats in India, to actually think of these plans, because they are the ones most affected, they are the ones most invested, and they are the ones actually with the practices in that particular context, which will probably help in both adaptation and mitigation. So I think that's, from a people perspective, I just wanted to make that point, that they're not sitting idle, and they probably know what best to do. And it's really, how do you get the climate finance down to that tier? From a gender perspective, just to say that people talk a lot about how women are affected from climate change and also from, climate events, particularly disasters. What one doesn't talk enough about is how women are also a part of the journey around adaptation and mitigation. In fact, they are at the forefront of, I wouldn't say formal management, but at least informal management of soil, of, agriculture, and so on and so forth. So if you don't involve them, you're missing a big part of the puzzle, because they are the ones who would actually be implementing a lot of the action on the ground. And there's this number that floats around to say that at least, if you look at global climate finance, only 2% really goes towards women eventually, or at least thinking about the efforts that women can do from the climate action perspective. So I think from gender, we need to think on how to involve women, not just in thinking about, their casualties and, the health risks that they face after disasters, but how can they be agents to actually, support this movement. I think the third point that I want to make is something that Varad said, which is very interesting, is and it this article that came out in terms of learning from the past, but equally, there are things that are happening in both ends. In India right now, we are closing down, particularly in the energy space, thinking about closing down power plants. We are also, the thermal power plants and also the coal mines, but equally we are thinking of investing in renewable energy and in in things like green hydrogen. Now, if you look at the macro picture, these are going to happen very differently in different states. So if you think of people who would be affected by the transition, there will be people who may be gaining jobs in the coastal areas, but you would be having people who would be losing jobs in the coal mines. And you don't expect the same people to be offset, against the jobs that will be, increasing in the renewable energy space and in the green hydrogen space. And we don't think of the skilling that may be required. So in the short to medium term, this is going to be a problem, particularly in states that are the coal mine states, which are also tribal and which are also poor, versus the the coastal states, which is where actually a lot of the renewable energy investments in green hydrogen will come up. Because the private sector, if you think about incentives, what Varad was saying, would like to invest in places where it can even export green hydrogen. It will not go into, where the fertilizer and the steel industries are and where the use cases for green hydrogen are. They would probably, go and export it to Netherlands. So it's really about, I think Varad made a very relevant point on the impact rate. A return on investment, what is it that we are telling the private sector to do eventually? And then I'll just say the fourth point, and I'll close there because Varad actually mentioned this thing about 100 billion. We've been trying to look at international experiences, particularly on just transition. And we have compiled, what South Africa went through, what Vietnam is going through, and other places. And if you just look at, say, for example, South Africa, we had about $84 billion that were there for South Africa. But the workforce that you are dealing with is about 250,000. And mind you, all formal. they're formally employed in the coal mine. If you just look at the state of Jharkhand, Arindam, that PDAG works in intensively, it's 1.3 million workers. And this is just the informal and contractual put together. And you're not even talking about the induced employment.
Yeah.
And we are just saying 100 billion for all of India. So it is clearly a lot of money will be needed. But then also there's a lot of political economy attached to what Varad was saying in terms of trust, because you're asking India to do this and probably transition away from coal mines to be, to have JTEP and other partners to come in and put in more money. But would India be willing to do that? Because now, its energy consumption in rural areas goes up. It has young coal mines. It has relatively younger power plants. So, there is a lot of trust and diplomacy that will need to come in. On the quantum of investment, 100 billion may not be enough. I just give you the South Africa example. And then how do you build, those bridges of trust for India to sign on a line to say, okay, I'm really going to follow this, and I'm going to actually close down my thermal power plants and my coal mines. So I'll stop there for now.
No, super points, Soumya, and particularly interesting is to also kind of how you brought in the entire aspect of, who has the onus to kind of look into matters of whether we look at reskilling, whether we look at, the gender dimensions, whether it's a private sector who also has to play the role of not only the financier, but also maybe someone who kind of helps skill the entire transition in terms of skilling to kind of regain the lost work that is going to result as a result of this entire transition approach. So here I'd like to draw in Roli, because Roli, in one of your recent pieces, there's this fascinating character called Sanjay Shashikant Karlekar, who used to basically work as a mechanic fixing the diesel buses of the Brihan Mumbai bus company, which is the BEST. And now how BEST kind of gave him the opportunity to get into, training to understand how to fix the EV vehicles. So it's a very interesting a story that you brought from those whom we never get to hear. So be drawing upon your experiences of reporting from some of these spaces, whether it's Jharia in Jharkhand or Odisha or, Tamil Nadu or Bombay or, the Raigara or other places, how do you see, the voices of community and people who are part of this entire framework, whether induced or non-induced or direct, be more prominent? And how could it kind of, be a voice in the entire decision processes as well as, the entire planning processes?
Thank you so much, Arindam, for having me for this really, really important discussion. And I think Varad set the tone for this conversation really well by saying that we can't we need to learn from the past. And the reason why I think that Varad set the tone by going to the past is because that's exactly how I feel when you ask me the question about overlooking communities or not listening to the communities, or are we even registering those voices when we talk about energy transition, or when we talk about electric vehicles, or we talk about green projects. Are we talking about the communities that are getting impacted? And there again, we need to learn from the past. Like it happened with the fossil fuel industry, which we see in coal mining hubs, what I've realized is that people in renewable energy spaces, as in people, the local communities in living near renewable energy spaces, feel as left out and as disadvantaged as the coal mining communities who depend on coal for a living, but feel that they've been shortchanged because the benefits have not been as big as the losses that they have seen over the past few decades or ever since mining began in the region. They've suffered groundwater depletion. They've seen their farms destroyed, and the number of jobs that the mines opened up weren't as many. And from formal to informal workforce that we are all aware of, the transition there happened nearly 2 decades ago. Now, it's a similar thing that's happening in the renewable energy space, and it's the electric vehicle mechanic that you mentioned, Arindam, is one amongst a few who got the skill training and who is enterprising enough, who volunteered to learn that because he wanted to stay relevant. He feared that he had just 10 years of service left and he'll be redundant if he didn't learn that skill, because the entire fleet in Bombay was going to turn electric. And what would that mean for him? So do all mechanics or everyone working with public transport companies get similar opportunities? I'm not sure. I haven't researched that, but those are the kind of fears that people have. There is a certain level of enterprise, but there's also a certain level of desperation. I'd also like to point out, because I mentioned renewable energy projects, I'd like to point out that people living near those massive solar parks, some of the world's largest, are, because I mentioned people living near coal hubs are feeling shortchanged. That is the case with those living near these communities as well. How do we draw out those voices? I think every state has a renewable energy corporation. And when they plan these projects, the least I think that, or the basic minimum that they can do is reach out to these communities to understand what happens to them when the land that they have been grazing their camels or sheep on or whatever turns into a solar park, and what are the alternate livelihood options for them. And also addressing at the same time, Arindam, you mentioned in the introductory remarks, aspirations, which I think is critical to this discussion, because the aspirations of people change when a project comes close to them. It could be a coal mine, it could be a wind farm, it could be a solar park, it could be any infrastructure project, any energy project. The aspirations of the local community around changes because they think that they should be they deserve a share of this great enterprise that's come in their backyard. They deserve to be part of the profit. They possibly should get jobs, a new school, a new hospital. There has to be some gain associated with a new project in their backyard. So I think those are the kind of aspirations that the state and renewable energy projects need to be mindful of to make this a people-centric kind of a transition, and kind of aligning with the subject of the webinar, so that this is a people-centered, we have a people-centered climate future. Yeah, I'll rest there. You're mute.
Thank you, Roli. I think it also kind of draws in from, what are the entire pathways that not only are presented as options, but also what people choose as aspirations in terms of one such kind of, large scale transitory approaches are there. I mean, it's kind of foreseeable. I'd like to take a step back here and probably return to Varad, taking a step back here from maybe the entire just transition part. If we even talk of Varad, climate risks, or say even climate disasters, the entire idea of mitigation, adaptation, the framework and the dialogues around it come up. But often we are, we often don't get to hear or read in the international, the national discourses about what kind of locally led adaptation, or LLA as it's widely known, programs play a role. What roles do such kind of programs can play? And do you see relevance of, probably, designing good LLA programs in the context of Global South, particularly India? Because my limited understanding of LLA say that Bangladesh has been doing quite a fair bit of interesting work, especially in its coastal spaces and bordering spaces around Sundarbans. So maybe, Varad, I would like to know a bit more from your experience as to what role good LLA programs can play in the context of India.
Yeah, sure, Arindam. And so, firstly, I'd just like to say that, unfortunately, adaptation and resilience has been almost like a stepchild in the larger climate discourse, but I think 95% of the, if you were to do a word cloud of the discussion, you would get words like net zero, decarbonization, mitigation popping up, and you'll have adaptation, resilience somewhere down there, right? So I think it's very important to bring that up, both in terms of focus and energy, and also in terms of funding. Adaptation currently gets less than 10% of all climate finance that goes in that space. I think I'll make a broader point to your question on adaptation. I think we need to think of course, the point on voice that both Soumya and Roli made is sort of super critical. Ultimately, adaptation works if it is based on the needs and aspirations of the local community, right? So that we need to find a better way. And I think now almost all formal processes, talk about voice, have some mechanism of voice, but is it really, is it more a checkbox exercise, or is it truly listening, that I think we are still all learning. And Soumya, I don't know if there are some good examples from the World Bank here in different countries. I know back in the 1990s, there was a whole movement around community-driven development, CDD projects of the World Bank. And I'm sure there are a bunch of learnings there, but I think we haven't cracked the nut on this, actually. We do a lot of lip service to voice of the people and, people-led or local-led adaptation. We haven't yet done that. I think the other thing I would say is that, on the question of how do we make resources available for these things, there are two thoughts I have. One is that we need to create special purpose funds for these things. And, Arindam, you guys work a lot in Jharkhand. And one of the great innovations, I think financial innovations that India did some years ago was to set up these district mineral funds in most resource-rich districts of India. Mm-hmm. And today they are sitting on thousands and thousands of crores of rupees. And the whole idea of setting up these district mineral funds through assess on mining was that, create resources for the local community that doesn't see the benefits of a lot of these resources and give them through a bottom-up process, hopefully, help choose interventions and projects that are relevant and can, create longer-term sustainable prosperity in these regions. Again, I think on that, the jury is out. We have collected a lot of money, but I think we have a long way to go in terms of deploying them in a meaningful way. So can we recharge and can we, we really galvanize that pool of money would be a second thought. I think the third I would say is that, there's almost like we need to take a methodical approach where we mix the technocratic with the bottom up to solve adaptation issues. And what I have in mind, for example, is, take a city lens, a city which is going to go through a lot of challenges, let's say, and this is a real example of, work that, BCG, where I'm going to be joining in a few weeks, has done with the city of Lagos, which is a, city of 20 million plus people, fourth largest port in Africa. And so there the question is, it's facing extreme heat, it's facing excess rainfall, it's facing sea level rise. And business as usual scenario is quite catastrophic, not very different from many Indian coastal cities. But there, I think the idea of first scope the problem. What is the cost of inaction? What will happen if we just continue with the BAU, right? And both the dollar value, lives lost, people displaced, all of that, and create a vulnerability heat map on which parts of the place are going to be more disrupted versus the other. So I think that is sort of step one. Mm-hmm. Second is then identify a good solution set. And this is where the voice of the people comes in terms of, there are 50 things you can do, but which ones should be prioritized? Where is the social rate of return going to be the highest? Is it going to be more resilient coastal infrastructure? Is it going to be, more resilient community interventions? Is it going to be better early warning systems? What combination of solutions make the most of sense? And what is the social rate of return on these? And then thirdly, using this as the map, then mobilize the finance. Some projects are going to be amenable to private sector, pure private sector. Many are not. And in those cases, that's where Soumya and the World Bank comes in, I think, in a very important way, who have the entire range of funds, all the way from IBRD, which is near commercial funding, to IDA, which is highly concessional lending, to MEGA, which is risk guarantees, which are going to be increasingly important to galvanize private capital in the era of climate change, to IFC, which is to galvanize private capital more broadly. So we need to then mobilize finance of different types and create a pool of capital to meet the kind of, the pool of projects which have been created through this process. So I think we need a combination of listening to the people and a very sort of old style technocratic approach, step by step, to find the right mix of solutions for the future.
I'll hold that framework here, Varad, because very important levers that you kind of have given us a very clear, I would say, picture as to what could be the possible steps. And on that, probably I'd like to draw in Soumya. I mean, recently, I think it's been a week or so where the World Bank has come up with its, I would say, brilliant report, the WDR 2023, looking at migrants, refugees, and societies. And I think the first infographic that drew all of our attention was where it mentions about how climate change could be that single most distress factor that would affect migration through income loss and loss of habitats. So in the entire framework that Varad mentioned, listening to the people, also the other factors of finances that could be kind of pulled in. This is just one category of people or citizens, I would say, who stand at the highest risk of losing everything. So how do you see, the entire mitigation and the more than mitigation, I would say the adaptation and the resilience play out in the context of what I can probably say climate migrants, like those who have to move majburi hai unke liye because of probably the heat wave resulting in the crops getting burnt. So maybe, some thoughts from you on this, Soumya.
No, thanks, Arindam. That's actually a very relevant issue. In fact, we have in India climate change and development report. The World Bank does a series of country level reports called the CCDRs, which is going to be launched, early next year. And this is something that my team is working on, both on the social dimensions of climate change and a background paper on climate-induced migration. The thing is, you can't really, when you ask a migrant why you're moving, it's mostly because of a wage differential. If you're taking that journey, you forwarded me that article, Arindam, about, going from Kendrapara in Orissa, which is submerged, to Kerala. Of course, it is getting submerged, but, you also move to Kerala because, economically, you think of it as a difference in wages. And so if you look at surveys like the India Human Development Survey, where actually this analysis has been done to ask, between all the rural-urban moves, what percentage was on account of weather changes in weather patterns? Actually, 8% people say that, which is quite significant. And this is between 2005 and 2012, that they moved purely because, there was nothing left and they had to move. And this is only going to increase. So there is this theory that we are using to do some analysis, which is around tipping points, and it is there in social. So where are the tipping points that come in? And that's where what Varad said in terms of vulnerability planning, that becomes imperative. Because, for example, Orissa actually has a vulnerability assessment tool that it started putting in use after the cyclones came in, which combines hazard data and weather data and rainfall data with actually socioeconomic vulnerability, which is very important. Where are the people below the poverty line, what migration patterns, etc. So you need to use that data to then see where the risks are, and also, of course, migration data, and then see these are the hotspots where eventually a tipping point is going to come, and do that sort of a modeling, and then marry climate finance. And interestingly, Varad, we did some DMF analysis. Orissa has 50% of all of the DMF money in the country. And, out of that, 30%, 27 or 30%, but out of that, it's about $2 billion just in Orissa. 50% is not even allocated, let alone, so it's just lying idle. And actually, if you actually speak to many of the finance commissioners, they will say, you get a huge amount of interest, and that money is actually leveraged to get cheaper loans for the state. So, but now when you go in and have conversations with them, as the bank with just transition, they're like, okay, we can open up the DMF for you. And we are working with Arindam, particularly in Jharkhand, to actually do a study on, migration, and of course, in a couple of mining regions, but then equally, the tools that Varad you were talking about. You need to actually develop the tools to engage and get the voices of the communities. And what we said to Jharkhand was, we will actually make transition plans for you involving the local communities by bringing in the CDD principles, and then show how this may be done. And it has to be bespoke, because every mine will look very different in India. And maybe then that becomes a pilot on how to do this. And I'll just say one thing, and then I'll close on migration. The thing is, if you actually look, there were some studies, interestingly, that were done in Jharkhand only, Arindam, which show that people who would want to move away from the coal mines any which ways, these are jobs. So the people who are these are jobs that nobody wants to do. These are people who are stuck in them because it's a monoculture society. They've been doing that for generations. But equally, they are the ones with the poorest networks, the poorest social networks to move. So one really has to address the migration crisis. So to answer your question specifically, yes, there'll be, outward migration, there'll be distress migration, and one will also have to think of how do you then, eventually, if they move, how do you build their capacity so that when they come into the, cities, they have access to those social protection measures, which will help them survive in the cities.
Yeah, I think very much like the match method that was referred to the report, that, what skills then kind of match, the entire mobility factor that they will be bringing in. Before going to Roli, I request, attendees who are there as participants, please feel free to drop in your questions so that we can post Roli's remark. We can then move to some of the questions. So Roli, kind of drawing upon both Varad's entire kind of observations around how the financial mechanism could work, drawing in both the state, the multilaterals and private sector, and obviously a bit of a shift towards how the entire, the missing community, which is, say, the migrant voices, could be kind of drawn into this entire thing. You have had, I would say, a lot of field reportage over the last 2 decades, particularly in the recent few years, especially covering just transition. How do you see building the capacity, or how do you see some of this reportage or some of these voices being captured? Because see, everyone can't do everything, right? The bank has a role, multilaterals has their own role. Similarly, the media, the community citizen journalism, they have their own role. And with our work with a lot of communication people as well as journalists, we often see one refrain that kind of stands out, that we actually don't understand these complex terms. Who is going to write about all of this? Who's going to capture these kind of stories? So how do you kind of see this dichotomy, especially in the context of regions where climate risks and also the transitions are going to affect or work out the most in this country?
Okay, that's a difficult one, Arindam, but I'll try and answer it. I think the dialogue surely needs to go beyond climate scientists, experts, think tanks, because to incorporate local voices. And that's an effort that journalists have to make and are making to bring in those voices. Now, I remember, I think it was COP26 when the Prime Minister announced net zero by 2070. And we were doing a report around that at that time. And there was this whole phase down, phase out thing happening. And the one voice that I thought of reaching out to at that time was a coal labor union leader, to ask him whether he was watching the developments at COP26. And I was surprised then, because not only was he absolutely familiar with just transition, he could explain it to me better than anyone else could. But also the fact that he was on Twitter all the time. He was checking all the tweets of the ministers there, of the Prime Minister there. He was checking every word that was being said at COP26, because he felt that it was their future that was at stake, and their lives were dependent on what was being said on that global platform. Moving on from there, I think there is, and when we go to the ground, every report from the ground does capture these voices. We as journalists do our jobs in getting those interviews into newspapers, digital platforms, etc. But I must point out here that the local community themselves are making their presence felt. It's for us to find those voices now, because I've met young boys and girls who are on YouTube, who are posting YouTube videos from their regions, and who are talking about their aspirations, who are talking about what they would want to do in life, how they want to be picked up by a dance reality show, for example, or how they want to become filmmakers. Are we even addressing those desires, aspirations in the local community? At the same time, the organization that I work with, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we also have training programs on just transition, on reporting on just transition, where we have a lot of, where we train local journalists from different regions. Like we'll have a training, say, in India, then we'll have one in Bangladesh, another in South Africa or Brazil or whatever. And we train local journalists to report on the subject, and wherein we discuss how can we make these stories more accessible so that readers find them interesting and they connect with these issues of the local communities. And it's only when readers connect with these issues that these voices will finally be heard. We are all aware of the constraints in the media industry and how much of ground reportage is happening right now. So mainstream media is not as focused on these issues, but with these initiatives, say a training program, or the few organizations or digital platforms that are still doing ground reporting and investing money in them are able to bring out those voices. I think there is some effort that's required from people at large now, from citizens of the country, to figure out where they can access these stories, because the job is being done. It's for people to find those voices now so that they can react to them and possibly influence how these policies get framed in the future.
That's, I would say, something that's promising. And our sincere hope is that, as a firm working so closely across both communications research and policy advisory, that, the more voices that come up from regional spaces, I would say, tier 2 spaces, from the areas that are most prone to climate risks, they themselves kind of curating videos, reels, or whatsoever, but which has an element that reckons people like us, to kind of rethink, reimagine. And, I think that probably is also one way of defining a people-centered future, where, they kind of define their own narratives rather than narratives being bestowed upon them. So with that, maybe, I'll just take a pause here, because we do have, I think, 2 questions, and I believe that the panelists also can, see those questions. So maybe, Varad or Soumya or Roli would like to go for, the first question, which I'll read out for the interest of the other invitees. Is Shantanu Bhomik, who asks that, how do you look at the role of Gram Panchayats or urban local bodies and the local governance ecosystem as a whole for addressing climate change issues? Especially in the context of what we have discussed over the last 45 or 50 minutes. So Varad or Soumya, either of you would like to kind of come in here, or maybe both of you could share like brief insights.
Yeah, I can start, and Soumya addressed this a little bit, I think, when she talked about how one should go about the just transition at the sub-state level. But I think I'll say a couple of things. One is, of course, many, at least on urban local bodies, are working on climate strategies, right? And many cities have got climate action plans now, varying stages of implementation, which is good. I think it's sort of, at least some ownership at an institutional level. There's still a long way to go on the voice question that we've been discussing. How many of these climate action plans have truly been developed by people's participation? Right. I don't think too much, right? So there's that we need to work on. But there's also the demand side, I think, a big role that ULBs and the Panchayati Raj institutions, which are really the representative people, can play. Because a lot of the, it gets under-discussed, but all of the stuff on how we need to change our lifestyles, right? And the life mission the Prime Minister has talked about, how we can adopt behavioral nudges and default options and so on to drive sustainable action. A lot of this is a Western conversation right now, but is there an Indian version of this conversation? Especially because we do want to avoid the path that the West has taken of overconsumption and that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of work and role for urban local bodies and the Panchayati Raj institutions to help communities find a better path and better demand patterns that will be more sustainable for the future. Having said that, I think, as we all know, the biggest elephants in the room on the PRIs and ULBs in India is the lack of finance. We don't devolve finance to lower levels of government, and urban local bodies have less than 5% of their budgets are self-generated, and so everything else is tied. And so, in that context, and of course, the capacity issue, which continues to come up, that if they don't have the personnel and the skills around new topics, they can barely keep the head above water on the BAU of running cities and so on, then how are they going to make an impact here? So I think there's a short answer to the question is that massively important role, but work in progress in many dimensions.
Yeah.
Soumya, I don't know if you wanted to add something.
To add, Soumya, on this, or we could move to the next question.
I mean, just to say, look, there was a report by Niti Aayog just released in 2023, and they do acknowledge the important role of Tier 3. But I think one thing that the report does also acknowledge is that there will be a lot of capacity that would need to be built of not only, of course, as Varad was saying, of the panchayat officials on how to actually do this planning, how to make the people aware and how to roll it out. I mean, that we don't have those tools as yet. and they are not trained in doing that. So I think that's one. And I think the second part is also on the locally led climate action. I think in terms of the funding, there are funds, if you look at the tribal Adi Adarsh Gram Yojana and all, there are untied funds, when you go into a village, and actually we did this assessment, they're not even using that 10 lakh rupees that is being made available because they don't even have the capacity to make a plan. And GPDP has been, in process for a very long time. But if you talk about the most impoverished tribal pockets, they don't have the capacity. So I think just to add to that, it is a good concept, it has to be done, but you need to really train the local tiers on how to interact with people too. And I think that's an entire capacity building agenda there.
Yeah. On that note, I think the next question kind of also ties in quite well. That this is from Siddhi Datri Pande. That the concept of sustainability is often looked at as an elitist concept, and it has been noticed worldwide that the total dependence on one sort of source alone, be it renewable or non-renewable, can be detrimental to a region or a country. And we also bind ourselves to climate vulnerability while moving ahead with such actions. So the question that's asked is that does maintaining a balance between the two a better strategy than going for a total overhaul transition? So maybe Roli, from some of your experiences, even speaking with policymakers or researchers or on the ground with people, how do you see this dichotomy?
Okay, I'm no expert like the others on the panel, but from my reporting on the JETP, at least I can say that that's exactly what India is trying to do. It's not committing to a phase out of coal. It's continuing with its coal capacity. It wants to build its coal capacity for energy security, even as it's investing in renewable energy. It has an ambitious renewable energy goal for 2030. So India wants to build its clean energy and keep its coal too. So which is the line that the country is taking essentially. But when you look at it, because I'm coming to this panel from the people's perspective, when you look at it from the viewpoint, say, of a village sarpanch or who have just got an electricity connection, say 5 years ago, and get just 7 hours of power a day or whatever, they don't care whether it's coming from a thermal plant or from a clean energy plant or whatever. They just want the continuous power supply. So energy security is important. We discussed aspirations earlier, and I think it was IEA that mentioned to me in one of the conversations that how people in rural areas have washing machines, laptops. They are consuming more energy now than they did earlier. And we can't simply think of a transition plan without protecting those aspirations of people. So it's not just about retiring thermal plants, it's about keeping a capacity, securing a capacity. So I think the question answers itself by saying that shouldn't we be balancing that? India is trying to do that, but I'm not sure from the perspective of emissions and the climate vulnerability of nations such as ours, whether that's a good, I don't know that the climate experts will be able to say better.
Just add one point to this, which is, I think often, of course, renewables gets the lion's share of the discussion, and electricity transition gets the lion's share of the discussion. But if you see the emissions profile, that makes up less than 40% of emissions, right? So I think when we talk about the climate transition, let's not forget the harder work that needs to be done on things like industry, whether it's cement, aluminium, steel, what are called the hard to abate sectors, aviation, etc., or agriculture, which depending on how you agriculture and food, which depending on how you measure it, makes up 24 to 34% of all emissions. So the whole discussion on reducing meat consumption, alternative proteins, better production methods of rice and so on and so forth, all of that is and of course forestry and land use, right? So all of that other stuff often becomes a footnote when the focus is on renewable versus fossil. But 60% of the problem is there, and we should make sure when we have this discussion, that is equally part of the conversation.
Yeah. I think we are mostly time, but there is a minute left, and maybe just taking permission from all the panelists because all of your time pressed. There are two more questions, but just to club them, So one, Bhargavi has asked a question, which, I mean, if I look at the second part of it, because I guess the first part has mostly been talked about, that what role potentially could technology play in facilitating the entire process of balancing out at one side climate actions and the other side this entire idea of engaging and empowering individuals to kind of shape their own futures. So that's one, I would say, probably that question where, if any of you would like to just briefly comment and reflect on, like, how do you do this entire balancing, and if there is a technological factor to it, like what role that probably a tech factor can play in that.
I can just come in to say that there are examples, I don't know, but I mean, one is, of course, in the early warning systems, there's been a lot of tech that has been used in terms of sending out mass messages, particularly, for cyclone, etc. warnings there. I think that's somewhere where India's done, or at least is doing well. I think the second is also climate smart agriculture. There is room. I think there are now usage of satellite maps to see where are the wastelands, where can forestry be done. Maharashtra has in fact started doing that, and that may be something that can be scaled up. But just to say that climate smart agriculture, we've been looking, at least in the agriculture practice in the bank, it is hard to do. You do come up with best practices, etc. But when you go down to implementation, it's just challenging to also train people in terms of, how do you use tech to see, how the droughts, etc. will come, how do you want to conserve water, how do you check dams? But it is an emerging area.
Arindam, if I can just come, I think Bhargavi has put another question end. And I just wanted to take that because I feel like she has hit the nail on the head. It's a lot of the conversation on climate change is often doom and gloom. We are all dying. It's all going to be over. And, let's act out of fear or something like that, right? But I think she makes a very important point that ultimately, if we want people to act, we have to also create energy, excitement, motivation around the potential here, right? And I think so. If I was to be, climate change is one of those topics, you can be either a extremely, you can be a prophet of doom, or you can be a, or a very hopeful person. So if I had to end on a hopeful note, Bhargavi, I would say that I think 2021-ish has been a bit of a turning point, right? And I would say that because you just see the kind of like the climate word is now, the discussion has moved from the why to the how, which took a long time, but it's finally happened. The kind of discussion we're having today is a sign of that. The fact that most large companies of the world today have now got net zero targets with a clear date, and countries, I think 90% of the world's GDP is now committed to net zero and on some time frame. Almost all asset owners, banks, financial institutions have committed to greening their portfolios in a time-bound manner. That's another first. I think the whole discussion on loss and damage, which started in Sharm el-Sheikh, has also now come into the picture. And I think all these discussions on blended finance, how can different pools of capital come together and raise the level of funding that is needed, which we need to increase by 5x if we have to meet our goals, is now beginning to happen. So I think there is a lot of, I sort of want to also end by saying, I think while this is an existential problem, there is much to feel hopeful about the future as well. And if we continue to, and I think the best minds in the world are now beginning to work on this topic. So I think if that trend continues, I think we can be hopeful and we should be optimistic about the future.
Thank you, Varad. And I express my regret to a couple of other attendees who have placed their questions, but I think due to the paucity of time, it's already 4:03, and what I can do is probably get the questions to all three of you to probably send them the kind of a brief response over email, if that's fine for both Vaishnavi and Kunal. And now may I request Sumit to kind of sum up and obviously play the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Arindam, and thank to all the esteemed speakers. It was really sort of insightful for me as well to listen from you about the kind of strategies or plans that we need to sort of make going forward. And a lot of work that we are doing at PDAG has been with the kind of support that we have been getting from our partnering organizations like ASER and We're also working very closely with the University of New South Wales around understanding some of these, I would say, dialogues and discussions that we are just having a conversation on. So with that, I would like to sort of thank all our participants also for sort of attending today's webinar on this important topic. All those who are interested, sort of also, get to know about our work that PDAG does. We request you to sort of follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn, or you can also write directly to us, on our email ID connect@pdag.in. So with that, we will close the session, and thanks a lot once again to all our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.